The pain of betrayal is devastating enough on its own. But when it happens at the most vulnerable moment in someone's life, the impact is not just emotional. It's physical, it's psychological, it's devastating on a level that many could never comprehend. This is one of those true stories that you hear, and, for a moment, you think it's fiction, because it seems too cruel to be true, but it is. She was betrayed in the hospital. While fighting an illness, while in need of care, attention and support, while all she wanted most was to feel like she wasn't alone. Instead, she discovered abandonment, lies, the selfishness of someone who promised to be by her side in sickness and in health, but who disappeared just when those words would have made some sense. Today, you will hear one of the most exciting, revolting, and intimate stories on our channel. Woman who chose silence while being cheated on, who hid his pain from others, so as not to worsen his own fragility. Who watched, silently, as the man who claimed to love her slowly distanced himself, until he threw himself into the arms of another. And all this, inside a hospital. This true story exposes deep wounds. It will awaken feelings that you may try to repress: anger, empathy, sadness, perhaps even guilt. Because at some point, everyone has felt alone when they needed it most. And that's why this story isn't just hers, it's mine, it's yours. She belongs to all the women who have felt abandonment disguised as love. Our character today, who, for privacy reasons, we will call here Clara, lived in an apparently stable relationship, at least from the outside. That was what everyone saw, a couple who faced life together. With its ups and downs like anyone else, married for almost 10 years, no children, but with many dreams. Clara was always a dedicated woman. She worked, took care of the house, her husband, and their routine. She was one of those people who forgot about themselves to take care of others. And this, over time, began to be explored. But she didn't see that as a problem. She thought she was lucky she had a husband who was there, who said he loved her, who still sent messages in the middle of the day just to ask if she needed anything. It was the kind of relationship she trusted with her eyes closed, until her body started giving warning signs. First, it was a tiredness that wouldn't go away, then, a constant fever. And, little by little, more serious symptoms: difficulty breathing, unexplained pain, fainting. She sought help, of course. She took tests and consulted doctors, and during one of these appointments, the diagnosis came. Clara had a serious autoimmune disease, which would require immediate hospitalization and ongoing treatment for an indefinite period. It was a shock, but she took a deep breath, held back her tears, and looked at her husband. At that moment, all she needed was him, of presence, from support, from "we are in this together," and in the beginning, he was even there. He accompanied her to the hospital. He held her hand. He brought her flowers. But as the days went by, he began to disappear. First there were work excuses, then tiredness, until he simply stopped showing up as often. He was late for visits, and some days, he didn't even show up. Clara, even though she was weak, began to feel something wrong. Those loving messages have diminished. His gaze was different. The coldness in the words, the rush to leave, the lack of empathy for her pain. She thought maybe it was stress or his fear, but it wasn't. Emotional distance, and, even worse, silent betrayal. It was inside the hospital, lying on a bed, surrounded by equipment, that she began to put the pieces together. Small attitudes, disjointed sentences, a strange scent on his body. That notification, on his cell phone, that he turned his back to hide. She didn't want to believe it. How could anyone betray the woman who was fighting for her life? How could he look at her, see her weakness, her pain, and still want someone else? But Clara remained silent, because the fear of being completely abandoned was greater than the courage to confront it. So she waited, observed. She held back her tears every time he said, "I have to leave early today," or "I'll be back tomorrow with more time." She pretended to believe, but inside, he was falling apart. And so begins this story of a woman wounded inside and out, who had to heal from illness and betrayal at the same time. who chose to tell her story because she knows that many other women have experienced the same silence. But now, you who are listening to this story, tell me honestly, what would you do in her place if you were lying in a hospital bed, depending on someone discovered that this someone was living a new love story outside? Would you face it? Would you remain silent? Or would you give up everything? Comment below. I want to know your opinion. Like this video, subscribe to the channel Royal Betrayal and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Maybe this story is closer to reality than we imagine.
Hello, my name is Ruth, and to this day, it pains me to say this out loud, but yes, I was betrayed in the hospital at the worst moment of my life, at the exact moment when I needed someone the most. You know that feeling when you're whole, life is falling apart, and yet you have to pretend that everything is fine so as not to worry anyone? That's right. I lived this every day. My body was weak, my heart was confused, and my soul was slowly breaking. But the greatest pain was not from the illness. It was the pain of abandonment. When I received the diagnosis, it was like someone had pulled the ground out from under my feet. An aggressive autoimmune disease that affected my lungs, my immune system, and could even compromise my kidneys. I, who had always been independent, who carried the world on my shoulders and didn't let anyone see my weaknesses. Suddenly I was there, lying in a bed, with tubes, needles, and the incessant sound of machines monitoring my life. And in the midst of all this, what I needed most was him, from my husband, from the man who swore to love me through good days and bad, from my partner of almost a decade. At first he tried. I swear he tried. He took me to the hospital, accompanied me during the exams, and stayed by my side during the first few days of my hospitalization. He would pat my head and tell me everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't long before he started to change. On the third day, he said he was going home to get a change of clothes, and it took him 5 hours. On the fourth day, he showed up with a serious face, nervous, playing with his cell phone the whole time. On the fifth day, it wasn't even. He sent a message saying he was tired, that he needed to sleep, that work was hectic. And so it was. He was disappearing, little by little, without fanfare. No justifications, just moving away. And I was there, alone, facing loneliness and fear as my only companions. I didn't want to think about betrayal. I really didn't want to, because in my head, that would be too monstrous. Who in their right mind would cheat on their wife while she was in the hospital? Who would have the courage to abandon someone who was sick, struggling to survive? But the evidence began to pile up. First was the smell, feminine perfume. A very strong sweet, which was never mine. I could feel it when he got close to the bed. Me, a cold, cutting certainty that told me I was losing everything. Health, dignity, and now, love. I felt pathetic. How could a woman like me, who had always given so much of herself, now be betrayed and abandoned in a white hospital room? I started to observe more, pay attention to his schedule, his excuses, his silences. And the more I saw, the more I felt I was right. But do you know what stopped me from confronting it? The fear of hearing from his mouth what I already knew, fear that he would really leave for good. because as bad as his presence was, the absolute emptiness terrified me. So I kept quiet. I swallowed every tear. I pretended to believe. I was grateful when he came, even for half an hour. I pretended to be asleep when he left early. And when the nurse asked me if he was coming that day, I smiled and said, "He's tired." But he's coming. I lied to her. He lied to me. And the disease gave no respite. I lost weight, my hair started falling out, and my immunity was dangerously low. The doctors wanted to transfer me to another hospital with better structure. And him? He said he couldn't come with me because of work. But that would be in my thoughts. That's when I started doing something I never imagined. I asked a friend for her cell phone number and started investigating. I searched social networks, I looked for names, I crossed schedules. And then I saw it, a photo, in a coffee shop. He smiling next to a woman. She leaned on his shoulder. The caption, "A day of peace at last," posted by her, tagged with location. It was real. It was true. He was with me in the morning, saying he needed to go to the bank, and in the afternoon, I was with her. I couldn't breathe. I had such a bad seizure that I had to be sedated, but I didn't tell anyone the reason. Not even for nurses, not pro medico. I remained silent, like always. And so I discovered that the man of my life, at the most vulnerable moment of my existence, chose someone new. He chose to start another story, while mine seemed to be coming to an end. But that's still not the hardest part of my story. The worst was yet to come, and I'll tell you all, every detail, because it's time to stop protecting the one who destroyed my soul. I could hardly believe what my eyes had seen in that photo. Him smiling with that woman, as if all the suffering I was experiencing was nothing more than a distant chapter in his life. It was as if, in an instant, everything we had built, all the love, the whole story, had been crumbled, reduced to a furtive moment of someone else's happiness, a moment stolen at my expense. That feeling crushed my chest, filling my body with an emptiness so deep that it seemed to consume me completely. The days that followed were a constant internal struggle. Corridors and mechanical noises, and that of my broken heart bleeding in silence. On nights in the hospital, when everything around me was calm and the world seemed distant, I allowed myself to break the armor I had kept on during the day. I cried often until I had no more tears left, until I felt empty, exhausted not only physically but spiritually. It was a tiredness that went far beyond ordinary fatigue. It was a deep loneliness that ate away at me from within and that no one could see or alleviate. I needed to find a reason to keep living, to not give up, and that reason seemed to be disappearing every day, just like the man I loved. He was moving away, little by little, more and more distant, not only in physical presence but in essence. His touch, which had once been a safe haven, had become cold and indifferent. The presence I had been anxiously awaiting had turned into a painful absence. And the worst part was knowing that he was not only far from me, but present with someone else in another place, living a reality that did not include me. My mind wandered through dark and frightening thoughts. I thought about running away, about dropping everything and disappearing, but my weakened body didn't allow me that luxury. I was a hostage to my fragility, to his betrayal, and to the illness that was consuming me. Many times I wanted to confront him, demand an explanation, break down before him with all my pain, but fear paralyzed me. Fear of what I might hear, fear of being abandoned forever, fear of losing even the little I had left. These doubts consumed me day after day, eroding my hope. I felt like a fool for believing that we could still have a future together. His silence answered all my questions. He was no longer my husband. He had started a new life, and I was being left behind, alone in that hospital bed. But I needed to survive. Not only the disease, but the emotional devastation that was taking over me. I needed to find the strength to get out of that bed, face the arduous treatment, and most importantly, face him. That same week, I received a call that could change the course of my life. A specialist doctor had volunteered to take care of my case. It was the opportunity I had been waiting for to fight with more hope, with more intensity. But it meant making difficult decisions. I would have to leave behind everything I knew, including the man who betrayed me. It was at that moment that I began to truly think of myself, no longer as the betrayed wife, nor as the sick woman who expected love and care, but as the Ruth who still existed inside me, who needed to be found again, healed and able to live. Deep down in my heart, I knew I needed to break the silence, expel the hidden pain, and face the truth head on. So I wrote. I took a notebook my sister had given me and began to write down every tear, every fear, every hurt. Writing became my refuge, my therapy. On paper, I didn't have to pretend. There, I could be vulnerable and strong at the same time. And little by little, the pain began to transform into strength. But the betrayal was still there, latent and cruel, challenging me every day. I needed to decide, continue in that relationship that was destroying me, or free myself to start over. The disease made me fragile, but my will to live was greater. I needed to make a plan. I watched him with extra attention, noting down schedules, routines, every disguised lie. Because if he thought I didn't know anything, he was very wrong. I decided that I would no longer be the silent woman, the abandoned wife. I would fight. For myself, for my health, for my dignity, for my future. But I still didn't know exactly how. It was then that an unexpected visitor appeared at the hospital. Someone who would change everything, who would help me see that. Even in the deepest darkness, hope can be reborn. The arrival of that unexpected visitor at the hospital was like a ray of light in the midst of so much darkness. I didn't expect to find someone who would make me feel, even for a moment, that there was still hope, that I wasn't completely alone in this fight. It was a new nurse named Helena who seemed to see beyond my fragile appearance, beyond my silence filled with sorrow. Helena had a special way about her, a sensitivity that touched me deeply. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, but offered her constant presence, her attentive eyes, and a smile that never seemed fake. Little by little, she became my confidant in the hospital, someone with whom I could share my fears and insecurities without fear of judgment. It was with her that I began to talk more openly about everything that was happening, about his betrayal, about the pain of loneliness at a time when I needed support the most. She listened patiently, without rushing, without pressuring. It was different from everything I had experienced in the last few months. I felt like there was finally someone on my side. This connection gave me the strength to face the difficult days of treatment, to endure the physical pain and emotional exhaustion. Helena not only took care of my body, but also my soul, even if in a silent and simple way, through friendship and empathy. But even with this new light, the shadow of betrayal still haunted me. Every time he showed up at the hospital, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and disappointment that consumed me. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to tell him everything I felt, but the weakness of my body and the fear prevented me. I wondered if, in this situation, he even deserved my anger, or if he had already become someone irrelevant to me. Thoughts about the relationship that once seemed unbreakable were now like shards scattered across the floor, impossible to put back together. I wondered how someone could exchange a love built over years for moments of deceit, as if everything we had been together had no value whatsoever. Still, I knew I needed to protect myself. I needed to strengthen my spirit so that the pain wouldn't destroy me completely. I started practicing small self-care routines inside the hospital, light walks in the hallway, breathing exercises that Helena taught me, moments of meditation to try to calm my turbulent mind. These simple practices, although they seemed small, were vital to keep me from losing control completely. I needed balance to make important decisions that were coming up, decisions about my future and what I wanted from my life, regardless of it. Every day, I felt like I was finding myself a little more, that the Ruth who had been lost in that hospital bed was beginning to awaken. I realized that despite the betrayal and the illness, I still had value. I could still dream. I could still be happy. Of course, there were days when sadness and anger took over, when everything seemed lost and I wanted to give up. At those times, I allowed myself to feel, to cry, to vent in the diary I had started to write. Because pretending that everything was fine would be denying reality. It would be a betrayal to myself. But these moments of weakness were brief because I knew I needed to fight, not just for my body to heal, but for the recovery of my dignity and self-esteem. The hospital, which had previously seemed like a place of endless suffering, began to transform into a space of reconstruction. Helena's presence, the treatment that was finally progressing, and the strength I found within myself gave me a ray of hope that I had not had for months. Even so, the doubt about what to do with him, with that man who betrayed me at the moment when I needed him most, continued to haunt me. I felt a deep internal conflict. On the one hand, the desire to forgive and try to save what was left. On the other, the desire to free myself from that relationship that only caused me pain. His visits became increasingly rare, and when they did happen, I could see the guilt and discomfort in his eyes, as if he knew he was missing something important. But it was too late for regrets. I had already changed. I was no longer that submissive and silent woman. I decided that when I was strong enough, I would have a definitive conversation with him to clarify everything, to demand explanations, to put an end to it, or to truly start over. Meanwhile, I continued to take care of myself, strengthen myself, prepare myself for whatever was to come. Because I knew that life could not wait, that I had to act for myself. I know that not everyone understands the complexity of dealing with betrayal along with a serious illness. It is a whirlwind of emotions that often seem impossible to bear. So I want you who are listening to me to know you are not alone, that there are ways to find strength even when everything seems lost. And I want to continue telling my story, my struggle, so that together we can understand that, no matter how painful the path may be, there is always a way out, a hope. The hospital continued to be my world, that space with white walls and silent corridors where I spent hours on end. But little by little, it stopped being just a place of pain and became a setting where I tried to rebuild my existence. Each day was a battle between the fragility of my body and the strength I needed to find within myself to keep from sinking into despair. The disease was consuming my body, yes, but I wouldn't let it take away my will to live. I had Helena. That nurse, with her silent presence and understanding gaze, was a constant light in my otherwise dark routine. She not only took care of my treatment, but also took care of my soul, offering a friendly shoulder that I never thought I would find in that place. It was with her that I began to truly open my heart, confessing every hurt, every doubt, every night when the crying seemed to have no end. My friendship with Helena transcended the hospital. Even on the days when I wasn't there, we exchanged messages and conversations, and the feeling a dirty secret, a shame I had to bear alone. Others offered empty words of comfort, which only increased my feeling of isolation. It was as if the betrayal was just my pain, a pain that no one else seemed to see or understand. With each visit from him, I felt a storm inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him feel my pain. But I also felt a deep sadness for this man who had lost the woman who truly loved him. His distant, empty gaze told me that he had already made his choice, and I needed to make mine. It was at that moment that I understood that I could no longer depend on him for my happiness. I needed to rebuild myself, even if that meant starting from scratch, even if that meant facing the pain head on and moving on without him. I decided to seek professional help. I started therapy, and it was there, in that safe space, that I was able to open my heart without fear. Talking about the betrayal, the illness, and all my fears was liberating. My therapist helped me understand that my pain was valid, that I deserved love and respect, and that forgiveness, if it came, would have to be for myself, not for him. The path was long and painful, full of ups and downs, but with each session, I became a little stronger. I learned to recognize my emotions, accept them, and, most importantly, to forgive my own mistakes, which, in fact, were not mine. Meanwhile, my body began to respond better to the treatment. I felt more energy, more desire to live. It was as if taking care of my mind and heart helped my body to heal as well. My relationship with him, however, became increasingly distant. There was no room for sincere conversations or attempts at rapprochement. I knew he was no longer truly present, and this, despite the pain, freed me from the expectations that only caused me suffering. With Helena's support, therapy, and my own efforts, I began to plan a new phase in my life. I dreamed of better days, encounters that would make me truly smile, a future that was only mine, independent of any man. But the path was not easy. The memories of the past and the wounds left by betrayal still hurt a lot, and I knew I would have to be strong to face all of this and move forward. One particularly difficult night, when the loneliness seemed greater than ever, I wrote him a letter. Not to send it, but to express all the hurt, the disappointment, and also the hope that one day I could forgive and set myself free. Writing continued to be my safe haven, my space for honesty with myself. And it was like this, between tears and small steps, that Ruth, who seemed lost, began to be reborn. But not everything was just suffering. There were moments of joy, of discoveries, of reconnecting with myself. I realized that my strength was greater than I imagined, and that self-love could be the beginning of a new life. After months locked away in the hospital walls, facing illness and betrayal, I began to feel a different kind of restlessness inside me. It was no longer hopelessness that dominated me, nor paralyzing fear. It was an urgent need to get my life back on track, to find myself beyond that chaotic situation that seemed to have no end. With each passing day, The treatment progressed, and I felt my body slowly react. It was a painful process, full of ups and downs, but with small signs of improvement that filled me with hope. I clung to each one of them as if I were finding a ray of light in the deepest darkness. But the emotional battle was, without a doubt, the hardest. The ghost of betrayal loomed over me, bringing with it questions that consumed me. How could he do that? Did he ever feel regret? Did the new life he was building away from me have any meaning for him? These questions hammered at my mind and hurt, preventing me from moving on easily. It was at that moment that I realized how much I needed to take care of myself. Therapy had become a fundamental ally, a space where I could cry, scream, and confess everything without fear of judgment. I learned to identify my emotions, to accept my vulnerability, and to understand that my pain was legitimate. Forgiveness, for him, if it came, would be a long process and only possible when I was ready. In addition to therapy, Helena's constant presence continued to be a pillar of strength. She was not just a nurse, but a true friend, someone who helped me see that I was not alone. Her words of encouragement, her gestures of affection, and the attention she gave me made all the difference in the most difficult moments. Over time, I began to feel a growing desire to regain autonomy in my life. The hospital was no longer my only world. I longed to start over, to breathe outside of that cold and personal environment. I began to think of small plans, simple goals, such as going back to walking in the park, meeting friends, rediscovering forgotten pleasures. But this transformation was not easy. The pain of betrayal still stung deeply, and I had to deal with the feeling of abandonment and the feeling that I had lost not only love, but also the security it provided me. It was a wound that bled silently, even at the moments when I seemed strongest. Some nights, sadness would take over, and I would find myself trapped in thoughts that would drag me down. At those times, I would write in my journal everything I felt: anger, fear, hope, despair. Writing was my therapy, my intimate confession, a way to free myself from the invisible bonds that pain created. Still, there were moments of light, small victories that filled me with pride and made me believe that I was capable of overcoming it all. With each step, no matter how small, I got closer to the Ruth that existed before the illness and the betrayal, the woman I needed to be to keep on living. In these reflections, I realized that my relationship with him was irreparably shaken. The silence between us, the absences, the unspoken words, everything indicated that that chapter was coming to an end. I needed to accept this so that I could close this door and open others. With that in mind, I decided that the next conversation with him would have to be definitive. I needed to understand what really happened, what he wanted for the future, and most importantly, I needed to say what I felt without fear. This decision gave me the strength to keep fighting, to face doubts, and to believe that, even in the midst of so much suffering, there was room for reconstruction. I know I'm not alone on this journey, and I want you who are listening to me to know that it is possible to find the strength to start over, even when everything seems lost. Now, I want to hear from you. How do you deal with the wounds left by betrayal? What strategies have you found to heal and move forward? Share your experience in the comments, as your story may be a light for someone who is suffering. Don't forget to share, and subscribe to the channel Royal Betrayal. Continue following this story that still has a lot to reveal. The days that followed my decision to confront him were the hardest I have ever experienced. I knew I needed this meeting to finally put an end to it or try to start over, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed me. It was as if a storm was about to hit me and I had to decide whether to face it or run away. I spent sleepless nights, mentally repeating what I would say, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that dominated me. Anger, sadness, disappointment. Hope everything mixed together inside my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to cry, but I also wanted to be firm and show him that I was no longer the woman he left behind. When the day finally arrived, the hospital was silent, and I prepared for that moment like a warrior going into battle. My sister accompanied me to support me, and that made all the difference. Knowing that I was not alone gave me the strength to face whatever came my way. He arrived with that distant look that I already knew, but this time I was determined not to let myself get down. I started by saying what I felt. I expressed my pain, my anger, but also my desire to understand what had happened. The reason for that betrayal at the most delicate moment of my life. He tried to justify himself. He talked about problems, about distancing himself, but nothing rang true. I felt like they were just empty words to try to ease the guilt he clearly carried. I was no longer the naive girl who believed in easy excuses. I talked about how abandoned I felt, about the nights I cried alone, about the pain of knowing he had been with someone else while I was fighting for my life. Each word came out with an intensity I didn't know I had, as if this was my last chance to be heard. In the middle of that tense conversation, I realized that as much as I wanted answers, they wouldn't be enough to erase what had happened. The betrayal had destroyed an essential part of our relationship, and perhaps nothing could fix that. That was when I made a decision that changed everything. I chose to prioritize myself, to choose myself, my health, my happiness. I declared that I could not continue in that relationship based on pain and distrust, that I needed to free myself in order to live fully. He was silent, perhaps surprised by my firmness, and I, for the first time in a long time, felt like I was in control of my life. I left that meeting with a mixture of sadness and relief, like someone who closes one door to open another. I knew the path would be difficult, but I was willing to face it. From that moment on, I began to build my new story. With the support of therapy, Helena, and my family, I focused on healing myself, restoring my self-esteem, and finding the woman I had always been, despite everything. Each day was an achievement, a battle won against fear, insecurity, and pain. I discovered strengths I didn't even know I had, and little by little, sadness gave way to hope. But the journey wasn't over yet. There were times when longing and resentment tried to pull me down, when I wondered if I had made the right decision. It was in this whirlwind that I learned to forgive not only him, but mainly myself. I forgave my mistakes, my doubts, my fear of starting over. And so, with scars but an open heart, I moved on. The decision to move forward alone, though painful, opened up a new space within me. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, I had allowed myself to breathe calmly, without the weight of that betrayal suffocating every beat of my heart. I wasn't completely healed, far from it, but I no longer bled every time I thought about him. Coming home after weeks in the hospital was an emotional process that was stronger than I expected. Every corner of that apartment held memories. The couch where we watched TV shows together, the kitchen where I cooked for us, his clothes still hanging in the closet. It was like living inside a ghost of what we were, and what I never wanted to be again. It took me days to touch his things. At first, I just walked past them, pretending not to see them. But one Sunday afternoon, between sips of tea, I plucked up the courage. I opened the drawers, took out the clothes one by one, folded them calmly, and put them in a box. And I cried. I cried for everything that was beautiful and ended so badly. I cried for myself, for the woman who endured the unbearable in silence. And finally, I cried for freedom. Helena called me every day. She remained my most constant support. We had created a bond that went beyond friendship. No, it wasn't romance. It was something much rarer, someone who comes into your life at a time of deep pain and doesn't leave when the crisis passes. She listened to me with a care that no one else had, and she reminded me, without saying it directly, that I was still worthy of love, self-love above all. Therapy also gained new layers. We started talking not only about the pain, but about the future. My therapist asked me a question that, at first glance, seemed simple, but it took me by surprise. Ruth, what do you want now? Not what you have. Lost, not what you fear. But what do you desire? I remained silent. The truth is, I didn't know. After so much time surviving, I had forgotten how to dream. How to wish for something other than the absence of pain. That week, I wrote a list. A list of wishes, no matter how silly they were. To ride my bike again. To travel alone. To paint my bedroom walls a different color. To learn to swim. To eat at an expensive restaurant by myself. It was a start. And then something I didn't expect happened. He texted me. After weeks of silence, he asked me how I was. He said he was thinking about me, that he missed me, that he made a mistake, that he didn't know how to fix it, but he wanted to try. Words, again. But this time, something inside me didn't react the way it used to. I didn't answer right away. I took a breath. I went to the balcony. I looked at the sky. I put my cell phone aside and went to sleep. The next day, I opened the message again. I read it all, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger or despair. I felt ... distance. I felt that the Ruth who suffered for him was no longer there. I had changed. He hadn't, so I wrote something simple. I hope you're okay. I'm rebuilding myself for me. And I turned off my cell phone. It wasn't a revengeful response. It was a real response. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come. The Ruth who had walked out of the hospital was very different from the one who was now sitting in her own room, looking at herself with new eyes. I began to allow myself moments of joy, even if brief. I went back to places I loved. I met up with friends who had drifted away when I withdrew. I went to a concert alone. I laughed out loud. I danced. I lived. I looked at myself in the mirror with less censorship, and I understood that solitude, when lived well, is freedom. Sure, there were setbacks. Some days I would wake up feeling the weight of it all over again. The memory of the betrayal still hurt, but the difference was that now I had tools. I had support. I had faith in myself. And the further I got away from him, the more I saw that what I called love was actually attachment. An attachment to comfort, to the idea of a perfect match, to the fear of starting over. It was as if I had been holding onto a rope for so long, even though it hurt me, afraid of falling. And when I let go, I realized there was no falling. There was flight. Helena told me this. Letting go is not falling, Ruth. Letting go is making room to fly. And I flew, even with injured wings. Today, writing all this, I realized that the love I needed was my own. And that as much as the betrayal marked me, it also taught me the strength that I carry. And that ... no one else can take away from me. After that message, I sent him short, direct, and calm. Something inside me settled down once and for all. It was as if, for the first time in my entire journey, I had closed the cycle with my own hands. There was no shouting, there was no scandal. There was only clarity. And that was when I realized healing does not happen in the noise of confrontation, but in the silence of firm decisions. In the following days, I began to feel more present in myself. I began to notice the little things, the sun coming through, the window in the morning, the sound of the birds that I had previously ignored, the smell of freshly brewed coffee that I drank alone, but with pleasure. Simple things, but that had never made so much sense. It was as if the whole world was inviting me to live again. And this time, for myself, but it wasn't a fairy tale. There was still pain. There were still memories that surfaced involuntarily. A scent in the grocery aisle, a song on the radio, a memory thrown in the form of a dream. The difference was that I no longer held on to these memories. I let them pass by like someone watching a train leave without trying to get on. Helena remained firm with me. Our meetings, now outside the hospital, had become the lightest space in my life. She was the kind of person who listens without interrupting, who doesn't offer ready-made answers, but questions that make you dig deep. With her, I felt seen. And it was during one of these meetings that she asked me something that disarmed me. "Ruth, have you forgiven yourself yet?" I remained silent. That question took me by surprise. I thought the healing process was about forgiving others, letting go of the past. But I had never thought about how much I still blamed myself. Yes, I blamed myself for trusting too much, for not seeing the signs, for keeping quiet when I should have screamed, for giving myself completely to someone who didn't know how to care for me. I blamed myself for getting sick physically and emotionally. And most of all, I blamed myself for allowing him to hurt me so badly and for staying trapped in that web of pain for so long. That night, I cried like I hadn't cried in a long time. Fear had paralyzed her, but she had survived. And a final one to the Ruth who was now being reborn, and this was the hardest one to write because it required me to admit I deserved to be happy. I kept these letters in a box, along with other memories of the hospital, of the pain, of the struggle, not as a way of clinging to the suffering, but as a reminder of the strength that brought me here. Therapy, which had once been a salvation, now became a mirror. I no longer talked only about him. I talked about myself, my childhood, my insecurities, my difficulty in setting boundaries. I discovered that the betrayal was an open wound, but that there were other, older ones that I carried and had never had the courage to look at. And that changed everything. I started working on self-compassion, self-esteem, and emotional independence. I went back to school, took an online course I had always wanted to take, and on impulse, signed up for a writing workshop. It seemed like a small step, but it was a turning point. Writing connected me with who I was before anything else, and showed me who I could be from then on. In this workshop, I met other women with stories as difficult as mine, if not more so. And I realized how much more common the pain of betrayal is than it seems, and how much it is silenced. We created a group, exchanged texts, vented, laughed, and cried. It was a welcoming space where none of us needed to pretend to be strong. When everything hurt inside, one of them told me something that I still carry with me today. Being cheated on doesn't define me. What defines me is what I do with it. And I was doing something. I was remaking myself. The desire to love again began to emerge, timidly, as if asking for permission. But this time, with a different awareness. I didn't want to throw myself into other people's arms to fill in the gaps. I wanted one day to find someone who would see me whole, and not just as a refuge. But above all, I wanted to be enough for myself, to be enough for me. Little by little, I started closing circles. I deleted old photos, blocked social networks, uninstalled apps that kept me trapped in memories. Not with anger, with peace. With the certainty that the past no longer controlled me. Today, looking back, I see that I am not the same Ruth. and I don't want to be. The pain shaped me, but it doesn't define me. What defines me now is what I build with what's left, and surprisingly, what's left is more than I imagined. There was a time when I thought I would never trust anyone again. The betrayal had eroded my faith in others and relationships, even in myself. That any gesture of affection seemed suspicious, any sincere smile seemed like a disguise. When someone is broken inside, the world doesn't always see it, but I felt every day how much I was being patched up inside with my own fingers. Within myself grew stronger. I no longer woke up thinking about him. I no longer tried to guess what he was doing or who he was with. I began to occupy my thoughts with other projects, other routines, other ways of living. I reinvented myself. I started taking care of my health again with more ease. The treatment was already in its final stages, and the tests were bringing good news. For the first time since the diagnosis, the doctors were talking about my definitive discharge, and that brought me a mixture of relief and fear. It was as if the hospital, that place where I suffered so much, was also a kind of safe zone. Leaving there was like being thrown back into the real world. But I was ready. I decided to celebrate this new phase in a symbolic way, alone. I went to the beach where we used to go together, but this time I went by myself. I took a new notebook, one of those hardcover ones where I would write a new story, literally. I spent hours there, sitting in front of the sea, writing the first chapter of my new life. I didn't write about him. I didn't write about pain. I wrote about freedom, about peace. About what it's like to wake up and no longer feel like your heart is in pieces. Back in the city, I began to live more lightly. I allowed myself to laugh more. I started going out with friends who helped me regain the pleasure of talking without carrying resentment in my chest. I no longer looked for someone to fill a void. And perhaps because of this, life brought me new connections in a natural way. One of them was with a colleague from the writing workshop. His name was Samuel. We approached slowly, as if we were respecting each other's pain. He also had difficult stories to tell, not of betrayal, but of abandonment. We talked for hours about words, books, silence, and new beginnings. At no point did he try to invade my space. And maybe that was what made me trust him. But I was afraid. Very afraid. Afraid of falling in love with someone again and losing myself again. Afraid of being vulnerable, of not knowing how to differentiate affection from illusion. I told my therapist everything. She listened to me calmly as always and said something that really stuck with me. You have the right to try, and you also have the right to take it slow. There is no right in love. There is what you feel, what you decide. If love seems different today, it is because you are also different. And it was true. The Ruth who was rising up was no longer the woman who accepted little, who confused attention with love. Now I knew what I deserved. I knew that true love does not crush, does not erase, does not disappear in the middle of the night. True love is presence, respect, constancy, and that ... I was learning to give to myself first. Samuel and I started hanging out regularly. There were no promises, just honest exchanges. He knew my story and never tried to fix anything about me. Unlike what I had experienced before, With him, everything was light and respectful. And that was as strange as it was beautiful. I remember the first time he held my hand and I didn't pull away. It was in a coffee shop on a cloudy day. He told me a sad story from his childhood, and without thinking, I put my hand in his. He returned the gesture slowly, without rushing. And then I understood maybe it wasn't love yet, but it was care. And that was already a lot. I went home that day and cried, but not out of pain, out of gratitude for everything I had overcome, for having endured rock bottom and still having the heart to start over, for still being able to trust even after everything. Of course, there are scars. Of course, the memory of him still appears sometimes like a distant echo, but he no longer dominates. He no longer commands. Today, these memories are just part of a path that has taught me more than any other. And I know that many women will see themselves in me. That many are at this very moment trying to understand why they were betrayed, why they were left, why they were silenced. And the answer doesn't always come. Sometimes it never comes. But the healing ... it comes. It comes little by little, in the firm step of those who choose to get up even when everything inside screams to give up. Today, if I could go back in time, I wouldn't change what happened. Because it was because of pain that I discovered who I am. It was because of pain that I found courage. It was because of pain that I now have a voice. And if you're on the other side, listening to my story, I want to tell you something. You too will get through this. You too will find strength. You too will look in the mirror and say with pride, I survived. And that's all. Life has a curious way of closing cycles. Sometimes it doesn't give us what we want, but it gives us exactly what we need, even if it comes wrapped in pain, silence, and loss. I learned this the hard way, but also the most transformative way. It's been more than 2 years since it all happened. From the hospital, from the betrayal, from the message I kept silent for so long, from the breakup that almost tore me apart. And if someone had told me back then that one day I would be writing these words with a peaceful heart, I would have laughed sadly in disbelief, but here I am. And not just at peace, I am whole. Samuel and I went our separate ways. There was never any hard feelings between us, just a mutual understanding that some people come to help us cross bridges, not to stand on the other side. He was the right presence at the right time, and for that, I am grateful. But today, my path is my own. I decided to live a season on my own. I moved to a smaller city, closer to nature. I wanted silence. I wanted to reconnect. I wanted to listen to myself. I started living with less, but feeling more. I exchanged the noise of my cell phone for morning walks. I exchanged the emptiness of social media for the sound of the wind through the trees. I exchanged the need to be loved by someone for the choice to love myself day after day. And in that process, something unbelievable happened. I got a call from the hospital, not to talk about me, but about him. Yes, him, the man who betrayed me when I was hospitalized. The man who disappeared after the last, I hope you're okay. The man who became an echo within my story. He had been diagnosed with the same condition I had, but unlike me, he had no support network. He was alone, with no contact with his family or close friends. He had listed my name as his emergency contact. It took me a few minutes to process that information. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part was moved, because I knew exactly what it was like to receive a diagnosis like that. I knew the fear, the butterflies in my stomach, the feeling that the ground was disappearing from under my feet. And against all the voices that told me to protect myself, I went to see him, not for him, but for me. For everything I needed to be. For everything I faced alone. For everything I needed to swallow in silence. I needed to close this cycle not only in words, but in my eyes. When I entered the room, he looked at me as if he couldn't believe it. He was haggard, thinner, with a tired look. There was no arrogance, no excuses. There was shame and fragility. We sat in silence for a few minutes. He tried to speak, but stammered. So it was I who said calmly, "I didn't come for you. I came for myself. To tell you that I survived, that I was reborn, that what you destroyed, I rebuilt with my own hands." He cried. And so do I, but it was a different kind of cry. A cry without weight, without demands. A cry that cleanses, that closes, that liberates. I stayed for a few minutes. I hugged him, not out of affection, but out of compassion. Because there is no greater justice than moving on in peace when they expected you to be in ruins. When I left that hospital, the same hospital where I had experienced my worst moment, something inside me came to an end. It was as if that story, which had haunted me for so long, had finally come to an end. And the most unbelievable thing, without resentment. Today, as I sit here at my desk, writing this last chapter, I know this story was never about him. It was about me, about how I refused to be defined by pain, about how I stood up, even with shaking legs, about how I learned to love my own company, about how I turned the cruelest betrayal of my life into the greatest strength I've ever known. Because it doesn't matter what they do to us, it matters what we do with it. And I wrote poetry, I was silent, I took courage, I made a new path. And if you are reading or listening to this right now, perhaps you needed these words. Maybe you feel broken, betrayed, abandoned. Maybe you are silent, afraid to say what you feel. Maybe you are wondering if you will ever get out of this. Let me tell you a secret, or you are going. And one day, without even realizing it, you will take a deep breath and notice that the pain no longer lives there. That his name no longer suffocates you. That the places you cried through are now just streets. That the face that hurt you is now just a memory. And when that day comes, I hope you celebrate. I hope you live. I hope you choose yourself. And please tell me in the comments, in the stories, anywhere, share your story. Because stories like mine, like yours, save lives. If this story touched you, freed you, or made you reflect, like it and subscribe to the channel .royal betrayals and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Because at the end of the day, we are not defined by who hurt us. We are defined by who we decide to become after the wound. With love, Ruth.